Hello and welcome. I'm finally ready to start asking you guys to subscribe to my channel. I've been reluctant to before as this has been somewhat experimental, but I think 3 videos in a couple of weeks shows there's a bit of momentum. So please do hit the subscribe button. As a lot of you will know, it's not easy finding your audience on YouTube, so I'd be very grateful if you could make it just that little bit easier. Anyway, enough with my tedious grovelling. Today I'm going to take a different approach to my previous videos, and rather than focus on a single game and its influences, I'm going to focus on a machine, the Sega Master System, and 5 classic games that support my view that it deserves to be remembered and respected as a digital sunshine generator. Ironically, for those of us playing it in Europe, this Japanese machine, ignored by Americans, felt like it provided an in-your-living-room connection to the beating heart of optimistic mid-80s American pop culture. This isn't going to be an entirely unabashed love letter to Sega and the Master System, although that wouldn't be too inappropriate given Sega's currently celebrating its 60th birthday. Looking back now, there's part of me that's slightly uneasy about the implications of some of these games. The pop culture I'm talking about was capitalist to its core and revelled in aspirational materialism. Can't say it seemed any the worse for that at the time though. As a side note, I don't at all mean to suggest that there was anything wrong with whatever games machine you grew up with. Just that there was a hell of a lot right with this one. Equally, the Master System had plenty of iffy titles that didn't hit the spot. Of course it did. But to be honest, I really don't remember owning many of those. We received ours for Christmas 1987. My brother and I had conducted a concerted parent pestering campaign and were overjoyed to finally get our hands on it. It was an instant hit, with Outrun, Hang On, Wonder Boy and Alex Kidd all under the tree alongside it. The step up from the ZX Spectrum, BBC-B and Intellivision we had previously owned was obvious and dramatic. Bright, full-colour, scrolling graphics, we barely even noticed the flicker at the time. It might sound a bit superficial to say the Master System was good because it was so bright and colourful, but this really was amazing back then. It lent the machine a dramatic arcade presence that felt gloriously sunny and optimistic. Nobody really doubts that the move from black and white to colour in cinema ended up being more than just a technical advance, so I don't find it too embarrassing to say that this made a real difference to us. Renaissance artists were desperate to broaden their palette of available colours, because it really makes a difference to the way the human brain processes a visual image. Colour has meaning. Obviously, the technology itself is pretty irrelevant if the games don't live up to the promise, but the Master System was in the right place at the right time, and was made by the right company too. Sega was on a roll of arcade hits, with Yu Suzuki's lengthening list of superscalers stretching from Hang On through Space Harrier, Outrun, Afterburner and Super Hang On. These were powerful machines aimed at providing unique experiences on top-notch hardware with moving cabinets. They simply couldn't and still can't be replicated at home. What could be replicated was the bright sunny look and tone of these games. I'm going to take a look at 5 games on the Master System that capture my view of this machine. I don't mean to suggest that these 5 games were unique in this respect, quite the opposite. And both Wonder Boy and Alex Kidd, which I've previously looked at, would have made just as good examples. A good place to start is with Space Harrier, often seen as Yu Suzuki's defining title. Development for the arcade started as a Harrier jump jet game, but they soon realised the jet would take too many frames of animation to look realistic, so they swapped it out for a guy with a magic space gun and changed the realistic backgrounds to surreal landscapes. It's claimed that this was somewhat inspired by the Never-Ending Story. I can see that the concept of the fantasy zone may well have been taken from Fantastica in that film. Otherwise, though, the resemblance seems to be restricted to the first end-of-level boss looking a bit like Falcor the Luck Dragon. The fact that you blast him to pieces the moment you meet him suggests the game may have been more inspired by irritation with the Never-Ending Story than any desire to emulate it. The real inspiration is more likely the sci-fi artwork of Roger Dean, who also inspired the Studio Ghibli film Laputa City in the Sky, which came out a year later. Basically, anything with a floating rock involved owes something to him, or at least that's what he said when he sued the people who made Avatar. The Master System tries its best to replicate the arcade, despite some pretty severe technical limitations, including having to misuse background squares to create the right number of sprites on screen. In all honesty, it sometimes ends up looking like a hot mess, but even then it's a furiously fast, colourful, surrealist hot mess. And frankly, there weren't many other games where you got to blow up trees with such reckless abandon. I was always amazed by the smooth way our space gun wielding dude starts running when he gets to the bottom of the screen, and can even trip over bushes. Any doubt about how upbeat this game's message is dissolved by the smiley face on the back of the gun, which didn't actually appear in the original. Unless of course you've read the comic Watchmen, where it has a whole different meaning. The next obvious stop is Outrun. It's claimed that this game was inspired by the Cannonball Run films, but given that you never see any rivals at all and the film's comedic nature totally failed to make it into the game, this seems like only a very loose starting point. More likely Magnum PI and his iconic Ferrari 308 provided some inspiration. The real inspiration, though, I suspect, was the millions of posters of iconic cars that by the mid-80s adorned boys' bedroom walls across the West. Perhaps because of the vast landscapes implied by the relatively bare graphics, I always assumed this was a drive from California or Miami across the United States. I was wondering why there were windmills there, that is now explained by the fact it turns out the real landscapes the arcade was based on were European: French Riviera, Monaco, Rome, Switzerland and German countryside. Apparently, Sega thought it was too dangerous to send its employees on a road trip across America. Part of the reason for me assuming it was America is that the first level seems to take you on a drive through a desert, which Europe doesn't really have anymore. But having now got used to the impeccable Saturn version, I realised this should have been a drive along the coast, were it not for the Master System's technical limitations. Moreover, the Master System couldn't handle the sprite scaling required to emulate the arcade, so it falls back on the well-worn by now approach of creating a feeling of speed and movement into the screen by alternating lines of different shades across the screen. This was no technical marvel, but it was a competent driving game, dressed in arcade Outrun's clothes, and what amazing clothes they were. This is aspirational 80s culture distilled to its purest form. A ludicrously expensive car from off your bedroom wall, a blonde girl in the passenger seat who is presumably having a good time, sunny locations that would cost considerable money to visit, and an actual choice of theme tunes to play as you drove. This is capitalism at its mid-80s peak. I don't think any other video game had ever even approached these waters. This was something new and distinct. I wonder if part of the thought behind the game was that it was always designed to cost more than other arcade games, so it should simply feel luxurious to justify the expense. Yu Suzuki did say that he wanted those playing it to feel superior. Nothing sinister about that at all. It's not going too far to see a reflection of Reagan's America in this game. The mid-80s saw American culture re-embracing innocence, materialism and aspiration, and it's all here. Nowhere represented this sunshine 80s American culture more than Reagan's own Golden State, and so in some ways it's not surprising that California Games makes it onto this list. In other ways it stands out like a sore thumb. The graphics don't have the usual tight coherence of a console game, betraying its origins on the C64. The hacky-sack guy responds sluggishly to commands, the skating is very fiddly and the BMX uninspiring. So why is it on this list? Well, firstly, it is still a pretty good game despite its flaws. Surfing and halfpipe I remember being particularly rewarding. The reason it's here though is that this game could have been put together by the Californian Tourist Board. Hollywood sign, Golden Gate Bridge, the ocean, the beach, all present and correct. It drips sunny optimism. And that's how it was sold to us in the UK. Take a look at this advert. Put sunshine into your computer. Now the summer will surely last forever. Okay, the skating level looks almost British in its drab seaside bucket and spadeness, and perhaps somewhat unnecessarily overemphasises the dangers of cracked pavements, but generally the whole game provides a golden glow. I've no idea what people in California made of it, but for those of us living through a UK winter, aspirational wasn't the word. The game even came with a list of Californian slang words, although I'm not sure I've ever heard anyone actually say tonar out loud. Totally gnarly, apparently. I think it's obvious I'm going to catch this, so there's no point showing off. As radical and gnarly as the California games may have been, for originality they don't compare at all to Fantasy Zone. Along with Twin B, the arcade original invented the cute-em-up genre. Theoretically, it's set in the same world as Space Harrier, but other than the high-colour sunshine surrealist vibe and ability of Opa to walk along the bottom of the screen, the similarities are fairly limited. The version playing here is actually the sequel, because it has somewhat better graphics and a lot less flicker than the original. The game is absurdly, delightfully cute, and I think it's probably the one game on this list that really reflects Japanese culture. For hundreds of years, the Japanese had created cute Netsuke ivory figures, and so there's a real tradition of taking things that might not immediately appear to be cute and rendering them into smooth, egg-shaped cuteness on a stick. Of course, this wasn't an aspect of Japanese culture that was especially well known in the West in the 80s, so there's little chance that kids playing this game would have made the connection. Of course, Japan was also going through an astonishing capitalism-fueled boom in the 80s, and as an adult, it's a little bit shocking to consider that when you defeat your very cute enemies, they are immediately converted into cold, hard cash. Cash which you take to your nearest shop to purchase weapons to slaughter more cuteness to generate more cash. That's a pretty serious corrective to the initial impression that this is a cuddly, comfortable world. Personally, I think the crassness only makes it more fun, serving to rebalance the cuteness, and this game is the one which impressed me most of these 5 when I replayed it for this video. Ironically, despite the kidsy look, this is the one of these games that I actually think I may have been a bit young for back in the 80s. The controls are excellent and really responsive, but I don't think I ever felt that in control back as a kid, whereas now it's a dream to play. It doesn't hurt that I can still half remember which weapons work best on the bosses either. This is the game that I've agonised most about including, Afterburner. But it was an important game at the time, and if you're looking at sunshine gaming on the Master System, it's hard to ignore these wide blue skies. It was proudly advertised as the first 4 meg cartridge, which means it was twice as big as Outrun. The Master System version runs pretty well, basically following the gameplay of the arcade, albeit with considerably barer levels. My problem with it is that Afterburner for me really does require the rotating arcade cabinet to make the experience fun, and it is more of an experience than a game in some ways. Fundamentally, it just isn't that amusing to play. Also, you can get through most of the game just by holding diagonally up left, which wouldn't make for much of a video. The game is obviously based on Top Gun, and again, like Outrun, it rides the wave of American 80s optimistic pop culture. The dark days of Vietnam are forgotten, the military are our friends and heroes, and one individual American pilot can take on an entire enemy air force, which Yu Suzuki originally considered explicitly making the Soviet Union. I guess Sega didn't sell many games though. I actually find this game more interesting as a cultural artifact, reflecting America's renewed optimism in its view of itself, just before it won the Cold War. The Master System was the perfect console to deliver these culturally significant moments, because its palette was wide enough and bright enough to express optimism, and its arcade games were perfectly pitched to ride the mid to late 80s wave of optimism. In the purity and upbeatness of these experiences, the Master System offered us in the UK an alternative world, because our 80s, whilst it did involve a boom, never seemed so innocent. Thatcherism was extremely divisive, and British youth culture was far more cynical. I wouldn't have wanted to live in Sega Land, but it was a great place to go for a break from time to time. That's all I've got for now. I think next time I might move on to the Mega Drive, a very different machine which tapped into a totally different cultural moment.